Do you want your story to give you more authenticity and authority and all of that kind of jazz? Or is it a story for building rapport with the audience? Or is it a story just for entertainment and that kind of thing? It almost doesn't matter which story you tell. I don't mind that people use different kinds of stories, so long as they have thought about those different types of story and the different reasons for telling them. So, for example, if my story is intended to give me authority, great, I would tell a story about something I have done. If my story is intended to teach people, it's better to tell a story about something else that somebody else has done. Even if it's the same story, you just change the hero within that story, if that makes sense. There's a thin line between doing that and making stuff up, of course. So you have to be, careful with your integrity about it.
Hello and welcome to episode 209 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we will air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review or rating. That would mean a lot to me and also help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Dr. Simon Raybould started life as a research scientist with a PhD looking at the causes of childhood cancers. It's this intellectually rigorous approach that differentiates him from most presentation trainers. But he's also been a lighting designer for dance companies, a playwright, an author, a teacher, a trainer, professional speaker, and fire eater. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Simon. Simon, it's so good to have you on today.
I am so very, very much looking forward to this. I've been sort of drinking tea and getting nervous about it all day.
All right. Well, we're going to get into your book, Story Making. But first, let's just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to what you're doing now.
Well, long time ago, I started out as a research scientist. I did a PhD in what they call geomedical demographics, which is a fancy way of saying statistical analysis looking at the causes of childhood leukemias. And then I spent 20, 24, 25 years as a research scientist and accidentally ended up getting promoted to be in charge of research scientists and realized that I was getting, or my research team was getting asked the same dumb questions by politicians over and over and over. And I figured that either scientists were very bad at explaining what they did, or politicians were really quite dumb. It turns out both of those things are true, by the way, but I couldn't do anything about the politicians. So I shifted my substantive research. So I was no longer looking at life chances and cancers and things like that. And I started to research how better to communicate and how better to make presentations. And from there, I realized that not only did my research teams needed it, but everybody needed it. So eventually I left the university and founded my own presentations training company.
Very cool. And you still bring that research-based approach to your teaching presentation skills and
Yeah. Yeah.
stories.
Yeah. It's one of the things that makes me different from most presentations trainers because I very, very rarely do opinion. I almost never do, this is what works for me. I almost always do, this is what the research says works for 85% of the population. Let's do that. If it doesn't work, I've got another trick for the remaining 15% of the population, but let's start with the 85% that we know this thing is going to work from. So I'm less warm and fluffy than some presentation trainers and much more forensic, I think is the phrase that springs to mind. I mean, my style is relaxed and friendly, but my content is much more hardcore.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you're on the Quiet and Strong podcast, and you are a fellow introvert. So, what's the strength that you have because you're an introvert?
Oh, my wife would say it's not a strength, it's a habit.
Okay.
It's what I call the assassin question. It's when you listen and you listen and you listen and you listen, and then you ask the question that cuts through all the BS that has gone before from either other introverts or more likely extroverts that are just filling the air and thinking out loud, speaking out loud. And you just ask the one question that everybody goes, oh, yeah, that. And it's the ability to synthesize and to pull everything together, and it makes it really it's a really powerful tool when you're making presentations because it means you can distill what everybody is talking about for 20 minutes into a 2 minute slide and then move on to the next thing. And I think bigger than that also it gives me an opportunity to, what's the phrase they use, respond, not react. So if something is not going well or something is not going as it should, or even if it's going better than I expect, I don't get carried away and react in the moment. There's just that half-second delay where I think and I process before I commit myself. And the number of times that has proven to be incredibly useful is just off the scale.
Brilliant. Yeah, there's some definite strengths to introversion. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean it's no better than extroversion. It's just different.
Yeah, well said there. And then, of course, we bust myths on this show. Is there a myth about introversion you want to bust today?
The obvious one, that introverts can't be professional speakers or public speakers. I reckon the ones that I really like working with are the introverts because they care about the message more than the audience, generally. So the generalization. Whereas extroverts tend to care about the audience and the performance and the love and the adoration and the feedback and the people in the room. Whereas introverts are much more, this is the message, let's get it over, let's get to our call to action, let's make something happen. And for me, that's what presentations are about. So I really, really want to just nail this myth that introverts can't do presentations. I reckon that a good two-thirds of my professional colleagues, of a certain level, so at a certain standard, a good two-thirds of us here in the UK would I self-identify as introverts. Partially, I think, because it's easier to control the room when you're delivering the presentation. And when you're in the audience, you're at the beck and call of the presenter, and that's a little bit uncomfortable for introverts sometimes. I honestly find it easier to be on a stage than in an audience sometimes.
Yeah, and I've heard that from others like yourself. It's like some of the best well-known speakers are introverts. And
Yep,
another myth that I'll bust is that sometimes people say that introverts don't have a lot to say, but that's not true because we are always thinking. So we have a lot to say, and a lot of times the stage is a great place for us to be able to share all those thoughts.
absolutely. I know this is a podcast, so people can't see it, but my head is going up and down. Wouldn't believe in terms
Yeah.
of how much I agree with that. And it's great because it means that with this introvert tendency we have to think first and speak later. By the time we get up to make our presentation, all our ducks in are in a row and we've got lined up exactly what it is we want to say and how we want to say it. So there is an awful lot less fluff and padding in an introvert's presentation.
Yeah. So Simon, I've been enjoying your book, Story Making, How to Use Stories and Not Just Tell Them. Tell us a little bit more about that.
About the book,
Yeah.
it came about because I saw an awful lot of social media adverts just going, tell stories, tell stories, tell stories, tell stories, tell. That's the silver bullet, tell stories. And it just sounded like some kind of demented parrot on acid or whatever. And I began to realize with my scientist head that it wasn't just about telling stories because there is no silver bullet for anything. It was about knowing what kind of stories to tell, when and why and how and what for. So there's a very significant difference, for example, between a story which is designed to entertain and a story which is designed to educate. And if you're just going tell stories, tell stories, tell stories without thinking about it, all you're doing is being maybe popular and interesting in the room at the moment, but you're not changing the world. And if you're not changing the world, what the hell are you doing it for?
Right.
If your presentation isn't intended to make the world a different place by the end of it, then it's just 20 minutes of very expensive C-suite time that's been chewed up for no benefit for anybody. It's either people need to understand something, or they need to do something, or they need to sing something that is different from how they started. Otherwise, it's just what we call it here, over here in the UK. It's just Jackanory time. I don't know if you have that phrase in the UK. It comes from a children's TV program many years ago, where somebody would just sit and tell a story on a rocking chair in a very nice. It was a TV program when there were only four channels here in the UK, designed to get children to go to sleep. It was the bedtime story before their parents put them to bed.
Yeah, I think we had something similar. So you were talking about the different type of stories, and in your book you lay out there's three types of stories. What are those?
Well, in terms of function, you mean? Because I can,
Yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah.
There's kind of, do you want your story to give you more authenticity and authority and all of that kind of jazz, or is it a story for building rapport with the audience, or is it a story just for entertainment and that kind of thing? It almost doesn't matter which story you tell. I don't mind that people use different kinds of stories, so long as they have thought about those different types of story and the different reasons for telling them. So, for example, if my story is intended to give me authority, great, I would tell a story about something I have done. If my story is intended to teach people, it's better to tell a story about something else that somebody else has done. Even if it's the same story, you just change the hero within that story, if that makes sense. There's a thin line between doing that and making stuff up, of course. So you have to be, careful with your integrity about it. But if I just want to go to the pub and be entertaining, that's just an entertainment story. If I want people to do something different, I might use a case study as an example story. So Google does this, Apple does that. That's kind of what I would call a teaching story. Apple does it this way, Google does it that way. Why don't you do it the same sort of way? Now, of course, you've got to be careful with that, because if you use an example that your audience doesn't resonate with. I have one occasion sort of Apple does this and it backfired because my entire audience were dedicated, hard-nosed Windows people that thought Apple
Uh-oh.
was overpriced crap. So you have to be quite careful with it. Although interestingly, I have also done some training for a bit of careful not to identify them here, but a company that makes Windows machines. And when I sat down in the room with them, so I'd got the top half dozen people in Europe sitting in the room with me, only one of them had a Windows machine, and it wasn't one of their own. Everybody else was using Apple
Oh
products,
no.
even though their own company made Windows machines, which was quite eye-opening for me. But the other kind of differentiator I want to make about the different types of stories is the kind of hero there is there. So we talk about something called we jokingly talk about a soap ladder, SOAP as an acronym. There are stories about self, that's things that I have done. There are stories about other people, that's stories about what Apple has done or Google has done or whoever. There are stories, audience stories. So these are stories about people like the people in your audience. And as you go along these steps of the ladder, the credibility increases in your audience's mind. And then there are what we call P at the end planted stories, which I'll come to in a second. But the audience stories is a tricky bit because you want it to be sufficiently like the people in your audience for them to go, oh, yeah, I get it now. I understand. This is people like me. But if it is people exactly like the people in your audience, you risk kind of triggering something called reactance, which is a psychologist's term for, how when you've got a teenager and you tell it to do something and its immediate response is to go, no, no, shan't. That's reactance. So if your story is too much like the people in your audience, you trigger reactance and they back away from what it is you are trying to get them to do. But the ultimate ones are planted stories, which is when I call them the shadows of stories. You don't tell the story itself. You hint at the story, and the audience makes up the story for themselves inside their own heads. And by definition, therefore, they are going to believe that story. They can't not, because it's something they have told themselves. And it's a technique that some politicians are great at. They don't actually say what they are promising, they hint at what they are promising, and the voters decide for themselves that they are being given whatever it is that the voter, wants to get. So they vote for the person telling this hinted story rather than an explicit story. And I think on both sides of the Atlantic, yours and mine, we've seen that happen on both sides of the spectrum a little bit. But those planted stories are incredibly powerful, unbelievably powerful. And the silliest example I can give for you is Hemingway. He didn't write a six-word short story, but he's famous for it. His publicists made it up, and the short story is just 6 words. For sale, baby shoes, never used. Now, that's not a story. That's an advert. But it's also a planted story because if I say that, for sale, baby shoes, never used, people's heads go, well, why are they selling baby shoes that have never been? Oh, Lord, how sad. And when you do that to an audience, you can see the moment the penny drops inside their head. Now, that's a very crude example of a planted story, but the idea is that it gets the audience to think for themselves what the story must be. So the SOAP thing is really, really quite powerful, I think.
Yeah. And another thing about this is some people probably just think it's just, just get up and tell stories like you're talking about, but you really lay out a system of telling stories and preparing for, the right story. Tell us about
Yeah,
your system.
well, there are some people who think they can tell stories instinctively, and a lot of them are wrong. But there are a lot of people who think I can't tell stories. So what the book does is provide a structure and a framework for people to get from the beginning of I don't know how to do this to be able to use stories to, and I use the word deploy stories deliberately because it's a much more mechanical way of doing things. So we talk about mining at the beginning, which is how you find the stories, and then we talk about collating, which is how you decide which stories you are going to tell and how you store those stories and which stories are appropriate for which circumstances. And then finally, there is the deployment. So it's a three-step process of mining, curating, deploying. The book goes into probably more detail than it needs to be honest. But I'm hoping I do it in such a light-hearted way that people can just plow through the bits that are a little bit self-indulgent and get to this. Even if they take nothing away from the book other than the idea that you gather these everyday stories in the mining process and you deploy them at will when you need them, then that's an improvement. That's an improvement. And the big thing that's really, 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 I think I don't explicitly say it so much in the book, but really runs through it is this idea that big hero stories just don't work. Stories about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro backwards with your teeth pulling out in the rain, with your hair falling out, and whilst being eaten alive by giant ants or whatever. They're great in the moment, but they don't change everybody's life in the audience. The moment passes. People are inspired by them in the moment, but not motivated in the long term. So in the bit we're talking about mining stories, I talk very much about mining stories from the everyday, from the edges of your everyday existence, things that illustrate what it is that you are talking about in the everyday that everybody has got. And sometimes people have more interesting stories than others. So it's easier for me because I've got two daughters who travel the world a lot and come home with stories that make me grey. I'm only 22, and the grey hair is because of my daughters. So it's quite easy to find stories if you're living that kind of life. But the trick is to find the stories in the everyday. And there's a technique in the book which a friend of mine called Kennedy taught me, which is don't ask yourself, has anything interesting happened today? Because most of us go, no, it's boring. I'm just, it's just a boring life. I'm just getting on with it. He says to ask yourself, what is the least boring thing that has happened today? And by definition, there must be something today that has happened that is less boring than everything else. You might not think it's interesting, but it's less boring than everything else. So, silly example, today, as I was driving back from the gym, there was there were two cars blocking the road and I couldn't get past. It turned out that one of those two cars was completely empty, but it was in the outside lane. How do you get an empty car in the outside lane of a road? Somebody must have stopped the car in the middle of the traffic, got out and walked off. I have no idea how that came about, but you can start going. There's something interesting that's gone on here. It's like being on the fast way lane of the freeway and just parking your car and abandoning it. Now that's not a desperately good example, but it is an example of something that's happened today which is less uninteresting than everything else. Certainly, it's less uninteresting than my 45-minute slog at the gym. which no one wants to hear about. That the journey home is just that little bit more interesting than the gym. Is that making sense? I
Yeah,
waffled.
absolutely. Absolutely. And how do you collect them? How do you document the stories that you're mining?
Well, I go over the top. I use Notion to capture mine, and sometimes just the process. I found that the process of writing them down fixes them in my head, so that I almost don't need to refer to my Notion app at all for the stories. But when I put them in Notion, the advantage of that is I can tag them with keywords, so that if I need a story about, for example, good leadership, I now just do a quick search within Notion and boom, there are a dozen stories about good leadership or whatever you want to know about. The only thing I have to do then to be careful is make sure that I've checked where the story came from, because the last thing you want to do is take a story back to the organization from whence it came, because at that point you will get that reactance thing that I was talking about earlier on. What you want is to take it from an organization that everybody recognizes as being like them, but it's not them. And in 20 years of doing this, it's only gone wrong once. Because normally what happens is they go, oh, yeah, that exact same sort of thing happened to us only last week. And your story has instant credibility at that point. But on this occasion, somebody said, yep, that exact thing happened last month at the place I used to work at. That exact thing. And it turns out that in the month between me collecting this story and me using this story, this person has moved from one organization
Oh, yeah.
to the other. I mean, the odds against that are ridiculous. So only once in 20 years has it gone wrong. But other people use different systems. You could just use index cards. The one thing you can't do is rely upon your memory, because everybody's memory is so fallible that you just end up with what is effectively fiction. It might be interesting, it might be useful, but if it's not true, there is a question about whether you can use it or not. And there's a shed load of research about how our memory plays tricks on us and what we think happened didn't, and all of that kind of jazz. I think that the jargon term for it there is the Mandela effect, after a lady whose name I've forgotten, who she very clearly has memories of Nelson Mandela dying in prison. She remembers it happening, except that he didn't die in prison. He was released and became a successful politician and ran the country and all of that kind of jazz. But she has a very clear memory of him dying in prison, because I think what's happened is that she's collated two different stories in her head and they've got confused in her memory. So the one thing we can't do is rely upon our own memories. As it's an example in the book, my wife points out, I told a story about one of my children, and my wife politely pointed out that the child I was talking about in that story wasn't even in the country at the time when this thing was supposed to have happened. But in my head, I had got my two daughters and a friend of theirs confused. I'd put those three things together, and I wasn't lying because I believed what I was saying. It's just that what I was saying was a mismatch of my two daughters and somebody else. It was a bit of embarrassment, really.
Yeah. And I think this is also part of a point that a lot of people aren't actually making the effort to capture their stories. But just like anything, you want to be successful in presentations and speeches, there's some effort that you have to put behind it.
Yeah, it's for me, the capturing of the stories is the thing that takes most time, because you get into a habit of looking for the stories in the everyday all day. So for example, I will, when I finish working today in an hour or two, what I will do is I'll just stop, have a cup of tea, think back over the day and go, what things have happened today that would be quite interesting to put down. So there's that thing I mentioned about a parked car in the outside lane with nobody in it. There's that we could even use that thing of I entered the Zoom room, and then because I was early, I went next door and came back, and you'd been looking at an empty camera for 5 minutes. There's all of that kind of all those little things that happen during the day, which can be used in a presentation or in your marketing or even down the pub telling a story to the mates. One of the things we talk about is pub-sized stories, really small stories that just work in the pub. And that embarrassing thing of me putting my camera on and then leaving the room, that could be used as a story in a presentation later on when you're talking about Even professionals make mistakes. Maybe I'm wanting to teach people that it is okay to make mistakes. Sure, yeah, you don't want to make too many, but if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. You roll with it, you learn from it, you move on. And I could then go on with, for example, I had a big interview coming up, and then I would go into a 10-second version of the story where you were looking at my empty office for 5 minutes. So even the little things can be used to make points.
Yeah. And then what's your second step after you mine? You say you also then curate your stories.
Great, yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's when you store them, and that's when you decide which stories to keep and how you're going to use them, and putting them into Notion. I put them into the Notion app. Other people put them in different places, so that you know what stories are appropriate for what circumstances. Honestly, that takes an awful lot less time than I make it sound like it does, because you just literally just jot down enough of the story so that you don't forget the details. You don't have to write the entire story, just a series of bullet points to remind yourself what's going on. And then tag them for where it comes from, whether it happened to you or it happened to somebody else, whether you've got permission to tell that story, because I've got quite a lot of stories in my bank where people have said to me, yes, you can use that story, but you must never use my name, or you must never use the organization I was working for at the time because, and that kind of thing. It's not onerous. It's not difficult to do. You just have to be aware about doing it. And then at the end, there's the deploying thing, which is the third stage, which is actually telling the story, and that looks very, very much like traditional storytelling.
How'd you come up with the term deploy? I like it. It's a stronger term than telling the story.
I spent a long time sitting around thinking about it because I wanted to get away from the fluffy idea that this is storytelling is a nice, warm, fuzzy thing to do to help our children sleep at night. I'm using it almost as an industrial tool, in the same way as somebody might use a slide in their presentation. Stories are more effective than slides, statistically speaking, but or a prop in their presentation or whatever. Or they might choose to wear a certain outfit. They might use a spreadsheet. Stories are tools just like everything else. And I wanted to get over this idea that it was a system. So just going, right, and then you tell the story at the end, it's just a bit wet. Whereas if you go and then you deploy the story like some kind of drone or driverless car or something, so that people go, oh, okay, I get it. You put it out into the world in a very specific, carefully chosen way.
Yeah. We talk a lot about personal brand and brands on this show. And in your book, I like how you put that your stories really make up your brand. Tell us about
Yeah.
that.
So if I'm going to be a little bit facetious about it and oversimplify it just for the sake of a soundbite, it goes like this: your brand is the stories that other people tell about you when you're not there. That's it. If people are talking about you, the stories that they are telling, that's your brand. You might want it to be different. You might think that it is your logo, but actually the thing that people are spreading, the people the viral element of it, those are the stories that people tell about you. So for example, Virgin Media over here in the UK has a reasonably poor brand because the stories we all tell each other about Virgin Media are about poor customer service. The brand they are pushing out is fast broadband, fiber optics, speed, yada, 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 yada. And it's all very, very exciting. But that's not the brand that is being shared. The brand that is being shared is things like when my mother in law died and I tried to send the TiVo box back to Virgin, they still charged me for having this for 6 months after blah, that kind of thing. So brand is the stories that people tell about you when you are not there. You might think it's the stories you tell. It would be nice if it was the stories you told. It's the stories that other people tell about you.
Right, right.
So I push hard this idea that I'm a research scientist. I like to think that my brand is friendly, but no nonsense in terms of doesn't put up with random statistics and BS. The brand that other people talk about me might be something like, I know it is like that, but the brand that other people talk about me is much more brutal in many ways. People will say to each other, Simon can be very rude. And then they'll go, but he's usually right. And now that's almost the brand that I want. So I have to, I have to be quite careful now to be nicer to people so they don't go around telling prospective clients that I can be quite rude.
Yeah.
I'm failing badly, failing badly. I am just rude. If someone's stupid, just rude.
So Simon, the other day I was talking to someone, brilliant, brilliant guy, and he was telling me that he struggles in presentations and speeches. He really likes to keep things concise. And we started talking about storytelling, and he just said, I'm just really bad at telling stories. What would you say to him?
Start with children's stories. There's an exercise I always give people who say that, which is to pick up a book or some, I don't know, it could be Let's Go Home, Little Bear. It's a story designed for very young toddlers. It's great, but I should be on commission the number of times I have mentioned this book, and just start telling that story to the cat, to the dog, to the television, to whoever, until you are comfortable with that, and then put the book away and turn on your camera, your Zoom camera or your Teams camera, and forget about it. Leave the camera on, let it run and run and run until it's subconsciously in the background. And then at some point during go about your normal day. And at some point during the day, when you feel like it, just turn to the camera as though it is a person and go, Little Bear said to Big Bear, and you don't make a big thing about it. You just do it whenever the hell you are ready as part of your everyday process. And if it falls apart, you laugh at yourself, you go have a drink, you carry on, you forget about it, and you have another go later when you are ready to do it. There's no point in pushing people into it if they are freaking out. Having said that, for the first time today, I'm going to step away from the research and give you my personal experience. So just skip this bit if you're not interested, dear reader. My experience has always been that people can tell stories an awful lot better than they think they can. They've just got this idea that storytelling is something you do with children rather than something you do in business. And if I say to them, tell your business stories as though you were telling it to your child when you're putting it to bed, the penny drops and they suddenly free themselves up to go, blah, blah, blah. Our numbers are up 45% this quarter because our sales agents are behaving differently. For example, so and so on the phones is now, and that so and so on the phones becomes a story that illustrates the point about how the sales agents are behaving differently. For the record, I've just made that one up. That's a completely spurious story that I've just invented on the spur of the moment. And at that point, it becomes all about practice. But I do want to stress that there's a difference between practice and rehearsal. Because you know that old adage of practice makes perfect? It's tosh. Practice makes permanent. So what I want people to do is get it right and then start to practice it. So there's no point in this hypothetical person who can't even read a children's story without falling over the words. There is no point in getting them to practice and practice and practice and practice and practice. What you need to do is get them comfortable with it first, and then when they can do it, then they practice. However, here's a challenging question. David, can you ride a bike? Pedal
Yeah,
cycle? Yeah,
yeah,
okay. So when you got your first pedal cycle, your first bike, how did you learn to ride it? Did you lean it on the wall and go, that looks awesome. As soon as I feel confident, I will get on that bike and ride? Nah,
yeah. Didn't work that way, no.
no. You got on the bike with stabilizers, with somebody holding you up, and you gradually got confident, and then you took the training wheels off, and then you got more confident, and then you You see the analogy, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah.
You just have to keep practicing, practicing, practicing. But the thing that people often get wrong at this point is they go, right, I'm going to practice storytelling in a safe home environment. Now, it turns out that that's a really bad idea because if you're telling stories in front of people you know, the stakes are higher because I have to see these people later on. So, silly example, right? I'm talking to a national networking organization this morning, and people were wanting to practice their pitch stories in their home regions because the people in their home regions, their home group, their local network, they were all friendly and everybody knew them. My assertion is this: if I make a pitch to you and it sucks, I have just blown any chance of you buying from me. On the other hand, if I make a pitch to somebody from, I don't know, Australia, who is never going to buy my bread ever in their lives because, hey, I'm a baker in the south of England and they're in New South Wales, and if my pitch sucks at that point, I've not lost anything because this guy was never going to buy from me in the first place. Physically couldn't buy from me. The idea, therefore, is that you practice your storytelling on audiences where it doesn't matter if it goes wrong, but what people think they should be doing is practice their storytelling to friends. And friends are our higher stakes. Because if I screw up in front of my wife, I have to live with her forever. Well, oh, I don't, but you know what I mean. I live
Yeah.
with her forever until the divorce comes through. But I have seen her life insurance policies and I have seen her pensions. I am not divorcing this lady. I am staying with her.
Right, right. So we're putting together all our stories, and my last question for you. So then you're planning for your presentation. What are your tips on preparation? And does it look different for introverts and extroverts, the way we
Oh,
prepare for presentations?
a hard yes. A hard yes. It looks a lot different. I So, okay, I'll give you an embarrassing story to illustrate it. About 2 years ago, I did a gig. It went incredibly well. It was a workshop of 50 people, and I got a standing ovation. Now, you can get an ovation for a keynote with a couple of hundred people in the room, but to get a standing ovation from a workshop for 50 people, that really took me aback. And as an introvert, I wasn't equipped for that. And I went to the toilet and locked myself in the cubicle for 10 minutes to catch my mental breath, if you like, whilst people were literally looking for me, trying to book me, and saying, we want to give you several £1,000s to do this work with us. Yeah, I lost about £10,000 worth of work because I went and hid in the toilet. And the reason I went and hid in the toilet was because as an introvert, I'd burnt out my mental energy by getting to the end of the presentation. Is that making sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So what I want introverts to think of is don't be as dumb as me. Think of the presentation as maybe the highlight of a process, not the end point of a process. So you allow yourself time. You psychologically know that there is going to be mental energy required in the follow up, in the photos, in the shake and the meet and the greet and the exchange of business cards and the can you give me a phone call on and the what's your link to get. All of those things that follow on from a good presentation, they require mental energy, and you should be prepared for that. Not assume that when you go, thank you very much, good night, that's not the end of it. That is the end of the performance of it, but not the end of the process of it.
Yeah, and that's a key to success as introverts. So we got to prepare for the presentation, but I love how you said we also have to prepare for after the presentation
Yeah,
and think of how we're going to manage our energy around all of it.
and it's not difficult when you remember to do it. but, but being an idiot, I forgot about it. Put my heart and soul into the presentation, and literally, people were walking around the conference venue going, "Has anybody seen Simon? I want to book him." And I was literally hiding in the toilets because I had run out of mental energy.
Yeah.
Pathetic.
So Simon, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything else that you want to add today?
Yeah, I think just one little thing. If you are going to tell stories about yourself or about people who are close to you, I want you to take this mantra. Talk about stories that are scars, but not stories that are scabs. Only use the story when it has healed. It's well and good to show people, look, I got this scar when I did something stupid, but it's a different kettle of fish to go, look, I got this cut because I've done something stupid and it is still bleeding. That doesn't serve you well, and it really doesn't serve the audience if you are using them as unpaid therapists. That's a personal experience thing, not a research thing. I'm not aware of any research in either direction about that, but it's something I've come to believe quite strongly. Scars, not scabs. Let things heal so that you can talk about them much more objectively rather than reliving the trauma of them on stage.
Yeah, good advice. So, Simon, of course, where can people find more about you and your book?
Easiest place is storymaking.business. That's the website, storymaking.business. And I've deliberately chosen the business domain, high level domain there, because I want people to get the idea that story making can be a business. And the other place, of course, you can find me is LinkedIn. Simon Raybould presentations. Raybould is Raybould, and the bit at the end where it says hyphen presentations is because there are only a few people on LinkedIn called Simon Raybould, but one of them is a Canadian baker. And I accepted a LinkedIn request from somebody. We were having a conversation about bread making, and I'm okay with that because bread making is a hobby of mine. And it wasn't until they said, "So, how many hundred loaves a day do you bake?" And I went, "What? Sorry, what?" I
uh,
maybe do a loaf or two at the weekend, that I realized that they were talking to somebody completely different. So I changed the thing, and it's now Simon-Raybould-presentations.
very good. And I'll put all that in the show notes. Thanks
Thank you,
again,
Thomas.
Simon.
My pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.